Hey everyone, James Marin here, and in this video, I'm going to give tips on 3 different things and speak about some things that I overlooked early on in my Steadicam career, but of course are very important for any Steadicam operator. Also, this video is broken down into different sections, so feel free to check the description below to check out all the different chapters. So first up is the in and out and side to side balance. Now this is one of those really basic things that is so basic that I didn't really find myself adjusting from camera build to camera build earlier on in my career. Now sometimes you get lucky and your in and out and side to side settings are perfect for the camera build that you're gonna fly that day, and the rig simply floats and feels sort of effortless. But sometimes you put the rig on and something doesn't quite feel right. Maybe the sled is starting to get away from you just slightly, or maybe you're not quite standing up completely straight, and in my opinion that's when you need to make those adjustments. So after I balance the sled and I tune the arm for the camera build that we're flying that day, my final step is to adjust the in and out and side to side settings. If the rig feels like it's getting away from you and you're putting more effort than desired by leaning back, then your top screw needs to be screwed in so the arm is angled towards you. Now, if the rig is floating too close to you, that you feel that you don't have enough room to move, then you need to adjust the screw out, which angles your arm away from you so that the rig could float further away from you. In my opinion, a nice balance is when the rig is slightly getting away from me so that I am conscious about my posture. And what I mean by that is that the rig floats exactly where you need it to float in a comfortable position while you're actually standing up straight. So that way, if you're starting to just slouch just even the slightest bit, you could feel that the rig is starting to get away from you, and that makes you conscious of the need to straighten your body out. Now, in terms of your side to side balance, the thing to really check for is when you're standing up straight, where does the rig want to go? If it wants to sort of sway a little bit to your left, or starts to sway a little bit to your right, or like it feels as if it's pulling you in one direction or the other, that's when you want to make those side to side adjustments. Now, in order to make those adjustments, the thing that you want to change is the top screw on the socket block of your arm. You want to go either inwards or you want to go outwards, depending on which way the rig is wanting to go. And you'll know which way you need to make that adjustment, because if you go one direction, it'll either be worse or it'll get better. And again, the thing that you're trying to go for is that you want the rig to just float in front of you in a way that it gives you mobility, but also is not too far away from you and not too close to you. Just remember that it's not just your sled's balance that's important, but the balance between the sled and your own body in conjunction to one another is equally as important. And that's because if everything's balanced and tuned correctly, then your movements are that much more effortless because you're not having to fight anything. Okay, next up is inertia. Now, what is inertia and why is it important for Steadicam operators? Inertia is a property of matter by which it continues in its existing state of rest or uniform motion in a straight line unless the state is changed by an external force. So for the purposes of what we do as Steadicam operators, inertia is important in the pan axis. Like the definition says, the more inert a mass is, the harder it is to change that mass's state of rest by an external force. That external force being either you intentionally panning the camera, it could be wind interference, it could be your own movement, really anything that is trying to pan the camera either intentionally or unintentionally. Now, why is inertia important for Steadicam operators? It's important because if we know how inertia works, then we can make adjustments to either our camera build or our sled in order to make it more inert or less inert. So let's say, for example, that you're asked to do a really slow, super symmetrical push-in where you want to have the crosshairs perfectly centered on something in the frame. And if you're doing it outside where there is moderate to high winds, then there is a risk of the sled starting to pan because the wind is pushing the sled from both sides. You then see the frame starting to pan away from center, and you compensate in the opposite direction to get it back to center. The end result is a frame that's slightly panning left and slightly panning right when you're pushing in or pulling out, and it sort of creates this wag. Now with a rig or a camera build that is much more inert, it is far less susceptible to those external forces. This resistance from external forces means that the camera is going to point straight ahead in the direction that you're pushing in or pulling out from, and means that you don't have to compensate for that wag. In most cases, I tend to have as much inertia as possible, especially when I'm being asked to do really slow moves. Now, how does one make their camera build more inert? Inertia could come from adding weight and length to the camera build with something like a shark fin. Or during prep, you could request that the AC gets something like this Preston MDR bracket, which would make your camera build longer because it goes on the back of the camera's battery rack. And of course, zoom lenses give you both weight and length. And in some cases, depending on what zoom you're using, you might want to be taking things off because it's too heavy. And the other option is to make your rig more inert, which could be done simply by changing the distance between your monitor and your battery rack. So to make your rig more inert, simply spread the masses out as far as you can. And to make it less inert, push in both masses closer together. So is there ever a time that it's desired to have less inertia? Of course, there are situations where having too much inertia doesn't help you achieve the shot you're trying to create. And the first example that comes to mind is whip pans. If your camera build or your rig has too much inertia, then of course it makes whip panning much more difficult. So in the case of whip pans, you might want to consider moving your monitor and your battery rack closer together, or maybe as close as possible, depending on the camera build that you're using, in order to help you whip a little bit faster. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about camera height. So this one's a big one for me because earlier on in my career, it's something that I didn't give a lot of consideration. The higher that the camera is away from the top stage of your sled, the further that camera mass is from your bottom two masses, meaning the monitor and the battery rack. Which means you have two options in order to get the drop time that you want to fly with. So option one is to extend the post on your sled, and option two is to add more weight, like adding a third battery or adding heavier batteries. Both compensate for your camera's height, but come with a cost. Now, the first option of extending your post isn't necessarily my favorite, and that's because if you have to extend your post a lot, then it sort of impedes on your ability to move, because if you have to move fast and take a bigger stride, then you run the risk of knocking the bottom electronics with your knees. But sometimes you don't need to extend your post that much. Maybe it's just like half an inch or like 2 inches or something like that, and it doesn't really impede on your movement because it's not that much of an extension. And that's could be because of either the camera height isn't really that drastic, or the camera height is drastic, but it's on a much lighter build. So if you don't have to extend your post that much, if it's just like a matter of like half an inch or an inch or whatever, or it's something that isn't going to impede on your movement, then perhaps isn't something that you need to worry about. But let's say that you're flying a much heavier build, maybe it's a zoom build, and in that case, you definitely don't want to have any height or any added height to the camera. That means things like having a bridge plate, or having a bridge plate and a dovetail, and then your Steadicam plate goes underneath that, is a big no-no, because it just adds way too much height. Here are some examples of what I'm talking about. So here I have the first example of camera height and what not to do. Here in the camera build, I decided to leave the bridge plate on. I also left the dovetail attached to the bridge plate. And then you could see this is right here, my Steadicam plate had to go underneath the dovetail and the bridge plate combination, which creates all of this height. So if this is the camera, the bottom of the camera, creates all this height from there to my top stage. Now, I don't necessarily know how much height that added, but even if it's an inch of height, it still feels fairly dramatic. It does a lot. So in order to compensate, I extended my post, and I also added some heavier batteries, probably like 150 batteries and a third battery. So had I not had the bridge plate and the dovetail, I could have had the camera a lot more flush against the top stage, and it would just make for a cleaner build. It would also mean that I might not have to fly with the third battery, or I could fly with some smaller batteries and sort of make my life a little bit easier with something lighter, so I don't have to carry a heavy rig all day. And in terms of the rod situation, we could have also just done top rods completely and just gotten rid of the need to have these rods in general. Here I have another example of the same thing. For some reason I decided to keep the bridge plate on this camera build, and I also decided to keep the dovetail, which again creates a lot of height. And then lastly, my plate goes underneath that combination. So you can see it obviously creates all of this height right here from the bottom of the camera to the top of my top stage. And that, of course, like I'm saying, makes a big difference. I probably decided to fly without a battery in order to alleviate some of the problems that the height creates. So now that it's a lighter camera without the battery, I didn't have to extend my post as much. But you can see in the picture, I still had to do some bigger batteries. I still had to go with a third battery, another really big battery over here. I extended the post just a little bit. This amount is really not a big deal. Like I was saying earlier, if it's something along the range of what you're seeing here, it's not gonna impede on what you're doing. But again, I probably could have done no third battery if I just 86'd all of this stuff here, and I would have had the camera more flush to the top stage. It would have been helpful to have the battery because I'd have more inertia from having more weight and length onto the battery, and I could even extend the battery rack as far back as the rods could let me, and then that way I can squeeze out as much inertia as possible. So yeah, this is kind of a funky build on my part in terms of the decisions that I was making because of the camera height. So before we get into my third and last example, I just want to say that, of course, none of this is anyone's fault. It's definitely not the First AC's fault. It's, if anything, it's my fault for not having known better. I just didn't know what I didn't know. So, you know, it happens, and that's how you learn. Anyways, this is probably my worst offense in terms of camera height and build and just everything that I'm talking about in this video today. Here again, I have the bridge plate, and I also have the dovetail still attached. And then lastly, my Steadicam plate goes underneath all of that. For some reason, even though we're flying this zoom, which I don't remember if it was particularly heavy, but you know, it's a zoom, it's probably gonna be on the heavier side of things. It is already long. I probably should have just 86'd the batteries, but you can see I have a shark fin for some reason. I decided to keep more weight and length to that, but probably could have 86'd the batteries and just powered the sled, or powered the camera through the sled with a cable, and you know, I'd have plenty of inertia from the length and weight of the camera build from the lens without needing the batteries. Anyways, so because of the height, you can see I still had to extend the post quite a bit. This is starting to be long enough where it can impede on your movement. At least for me, I wouldn't want to have that much length unless I absolutely had no other choice. This battery right here is probably one of the heaviest batteries that they make. I want to say it's over 5 pounds, and specifically got it to be a big counterweight balance for, you know, heavier builds like this. But again, with this build being already big and heavy, adding even more weight just makes it more cumbersome, and just you're just carrying more weight throughout the day, so you're just gonna get tired faster. What else can I say about this build? These rods. I probably could have 86'd the rods. If we had 86'd everything here, I could do top rods and then do the motors on the top, which would, again, you know, alleviate that height because I'm flush to the top stage. And also with zoom builds, I typically fly with a Steadicam long plate, so it's a plate that's double the size, probably something like this long. And I usually I have a bunch of little screws and brackets that I could put on it to do like a makeshift lens support. So, you know, for anyone thinking like, oh, well, you still needed lens support and you still needed to have motors on the rods, well, all of that could have been alleviated with top rods and a Steadicam long plate. Anyways, this is a really good example of, you know, some of the things of what not to do in terms of camera height. All right, that's it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed and got value out of these 3 tips that I presented here today, and that they'll help you out in one of your future shoots. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I hope you have a great day.